Hello, Year 5s and 6s. Today we are going to use the plan that you've made to write an opening for our story based on the arrival. And to start with, I'm going to read you an example of what a good one reads like. So you're going to listen to this example extract from the arrival, and you're going to think about what makes it an effective story opening. Do you have everything you need? Catherine questioned her husband as tears welled up in her eyes. She knew this day was going to be the hardest one yet, and there had been many hard days during the past 2 years. She blinked away her heartbreak, knowing she had to be strong. George nodded and closed the suitcase with a quiet click. His hands were shaking as he stood in silence, staring at the place where the family photograph had once stood. Deep down, he knew this was the best thing for everyone, but it didn't mean it was easy, though. The boiling of the kettle broke his daydream, and a reassuring hand was suddenly squeezing his. Breathing in the familiar smells of the kitchen, George turned and smiled at Catherine. He was the luckiest man alive. She had stood by him through thick and thin, even when their lives had been turned upside down. He could never forget that day. He would give anything to turn back the clocks, to keep his mouth shut, and maybe, just maybe, if he had bitten his tongue, then his precious family would not be torn apart. When Mr. Smith had fired him, he knew it was bad, but George had no idea just how difficult it would be to find another job. There were no jobs, there was no money, there was nothing left for them in this town. Suddenly, familiar footsteps padded down the stairs, and in tottered Elizabeth. A ray of sunlight filled the room. George reached out his arms and Lizzie jumped up. He squeezed and squeezed, savouring every precious moment. He didn't know how long it would be until he could do this again. Do you have to go, Daddy? I'm afraid I do, sweetheart. George glanced towards Catherine. I have to find a new job, and I promise it won't be long until you, Mummy, can come and join me. Promise? Lizzie asked. Promise, George answered, and popped a kiss on the end of her nose. Just pause for a minute and read that through and have a think about why that is an effective start to the story. Well, hopefully you will have realised that there's a bit of a backstory here about why George was having to leave, which the book and the video don't really give us much of a clue about. So the writer has put that in to give us a bit of information. Also, it establishes the fact that they're a close family, and you can tell that George and Catherine don't want to be parted, and it establishes that they have a little girl who they love very much. And also we know that George is going to have to leave his home, which clearly nobody is very happy about. So quite an effective beginning there. You're going to write something like this in a short while. But first, we're just going to go over how to do speech punctuation, because there are rules that we need to follow, and sometimes we do forget these rules when we're in full flow with writing. So the first one we have here is add inverted commas at the start and the end of the words which are being spoken. So the inverted commas before the first word spoken and after the last word spoken are just like making a speech bubble. That's exactly what they do, the same job. Use a capital letter at the start of speech. This is one that people tend to forget because they don't see it as the start of a sentence. But of course, any spoken words are the speaker's sentence, so you do always need that capital letter. Each time a new person speaks, begin a new line. Very important, that one. Punctuation goes inside the inverted commas, so before you close the inverted commas, there will usually be a comma, although sometimes it might be an exclamation mark or a question mark. It will only be a full stop if the whole sentence is finished. When speech is interrupted in mid-sentence by a reporting clause, reopen the direct speech in lowercase, e.g., don't climb on the wall, shouted Mrs. Bloggs as she hung out the washing, because you might fall and hurt yourself. So, capital letter at the very start of her speech, but when we reopen, because we're continuing her sentence, it's a small letter here. This, of course, shouted Mrs. Broggs as she hung out the washing, is the reporting clause. Right, let's see if you can remember some of those rules. Can you identify any examples of these rules in the story extract? Let's have another look. Suddenly, familiar footsteps padded down the stairs and in tottered Elizabeth. A ray of sunlight filled the room. George reached out his arms and Lizzie jumped up. He squeezed and squeezed, savouring every precious moment. He didn't know how long it would be until he could do this again. Do you have to go, Daddy? I'm afraid I do, sweetheart. George glanced towards Catherine. Because I have to find a new job, and I promise it won't be long until you and Mummy can come and join me. Promise? Lizzie asked. Promise, George answered, and he popped a kiss on the end of her nose. Pop me on pause for a couple of minutes and see if you can apply any of the rules that we just went through for punctuating speech in this extract here. Okay, hopefully you will have noticed that every time the speech opens, there is a capital letter. Here's an example. Here's another one. Here's another one. You will also have noticed that in this speech here, where the speech is interrupted by a reporting clause, George glanced towards Catherine, it reopens again here with a small letter, not a capital. Also, you will notice that there is a piece of punctuation always before the inverted commas close. We've got a question mark here, comma here, exclamation mark here, and so on. And finally, this is George speaking, this is Lizzie speaking, then George speaks again. You will notice that we start a new line for each new speaker. Don't keep continuing writing on the same line. That's the rules. New line for a new speaker. Okay, hope we've remembered all of that. Now for today's task, please would you write the opening for the story, which will focus on the main event on our plan. And the first thing on your plan is preparing to leave home. So just like the example that I read for you, I want you to write about that scene where they're in the kitchen and the little girl comes downstairs and the conversation between them. Please try to include some speech so you can practice your speed punctuation. And if you're not sure, you can refer back to the example that I read for you, which is earlier in the video. Right, so when we start tomorrow, you will have written your opening. Good luck with that, and we look forward to reading some of them. Bye now.